Trevor Cole's hands were shaking so violently, the platinum band rattled against the silk lining of the ring box. He didn't look like a groom. He looked like a man facing a firing squad. 500 of the city's most elite guests watched in a suffocating silence as his face went a sickly shade of pale. He looked at Keoma, stunning in her white lace and tulle, and he crumbled. "I can't," Trevor whispered, the sound carrying through the high-end acoustics of the cathedral. He fumbled with the ring, nearly dropping it as he took a defensive step backward, away from the altar and the woman he was about to shatter. "I'm sorry, Keoma, I can't do this." Gasps rippled through the pews like a physical wave. Keoma stood frozen, one hand clutching her chest, her wide eyes filling with tears that threatened to ruin her perfect bridal mascara. She was a statue of heartbreak, caught in the crosshairs of the most public humiliation of her life. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church didn't just open. They seemed to yield to a superior force. A man dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit stepped into the light. He was tall, noticeably more imposing than Trevor, with broad shoulders and a posture that radiated silent, terrifying authority. As he walked down the aisle, his upright, slow stride made guests shift in their seats with an instinctive, primal unease. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes, cold and predator-like, were locked on the altar. As he drew closer, the ink of a dark tattoo became visible, crawling up the side of his sharp jawline from beneath his collar, a signature of danger that made the priest take a stumbling step back. Han Junseo stopped exactly where Trevor had stood moments before. He didn't look at the shaking groom. He didn't acknowledge the scandal. He simply looked at Keoma, his expression unreadable but his presence absolute. He turned to Trevor, his voice a low, melodic rasp that commanded the entire room without effort. "Give me the ring," Junseo said. Trevor flinched as if he'd been struck. "What? Who the hell?" "The ring," Junseo repeated, his hand extending forward in a slow, deliberate gesture of reclamation. "You clearly don't know what to do with it. I do." With fingers that wouldn't stop trembling, Trevor practically dropped the band into Junseo's open palm. The exchange was a total surrender of power. Junseo turned his back on the boy and faced Keoma, holding out his hand to her, palm up, an invitation into a world of monochrome power. "Come here," he said quietly. Drawn in by the certainty in his tone, Keoma stepped forward on shaking legs. Her small hand disappeared into his warm, firm grip. Junseo turned to the 500 stunned guests, his thumb tracing the obsidian-dark ink on his neck. "I will marry her instead," he announced. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, turning a scene of abandonment into an unexpected acquisition. Trevor, now red-faced and humiliated by the very man he feared most, could only watch as the ground disappeared under him. Han Junseo didn't even glance back. He had already won. The air in the cathedral grew heavy, as if the oxygen had been replaced by the sheer weight of Han Junseo's presence. The priest looked between the trembling ring in Junseo's hand and the dark, intricate ink of the tattoo creeping up his neck, his face draining of color. He recognized that mark, a seal of the underworld that carried more weight than any scripture in this city. His hands fumbled with the holy book, the pages fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. "Proceed," Junseo commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. The ceremony that followed was a surreal blur of luxury noir and frantic whispers. The guests sat in a terrified trance, watching as the stranger slid the platinum band onto Keoma's finger with a steady, surgical precision that Trevor could never have possessed. When Junseo's fingers brushed hers, they weren't cold like the metal. They were warm, grounding, and held a controlled power that seemed to anchor Keoma as her world spun out of control. The priest's voice cracked as he rushed through the final rites, skipping the homily and jumping straight to the pronouncement. He didn't ask if anyone objected. He knew better than to invite a challenge from a man who looked like he could dismantle the building with a single glance. "I pronounce you, husband and wife," the priest squeaked, retreating into the shadows of the altar before the words had even finished echoing. Junseo didn't kiss her. Instead, he leaned down, his lips ghosting past her ear, his scent, sandalwood and expensive rain filling her senses. "Do not look back," he whispered. "Your life with that coward ended the moment I stepped into this aisle." He didn't wait for her to process the words. He turned, his hand firmly taking hers, and led her down the aisle. The 500 guests parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mosaic of shock and poorly concealed fear. Outside, the midday sun was blinding, reflecting off the polished chrome of a fleet of 8 obsidian-black SUVs idling at the curb. The doors were held open by men in sharp black suits who moved with tactical, synchronized grace. Juncio didn't break his upright, slow stride as he guided Kioma into the plush leather interior of the lead vehicle. As the door clicked shut with a heavy, pressurized thud, the cathedral and the ghost of Trevor Cole vanished behind tinted glass. The engine roared to life, and the fleet pulled away in a flawless formation, whisking Kioma Ackhafer away from the ruin of her wedding and into the terrifying, magnificent silence of Han Juncio's empire. The gates of the Han estate did not just open. They retreated, heavy wrought iron sliding back with a soundless, mechanical precision. As the convoy wound up the private drive, the city's skyline was replaced by high stone walls topped with discreet security sensors. The estate loomed ahead, a sprawling masterpiece of glass and slate that looked less like a home and more like a high-end fortress. It was a world of monochrome power, where even the shadows seemed to stand at attention. When the SUV pulled to a halt, the silence was absolute. Juncio stepped out first, and before Kioma could even reach for the door handle, a man in a tactical earpiece had opened it for her, bowing his head in a silent, practiced gesture of respect. Kioma stepped onto the gravel, her white tulle skirt dragging against the gray stone. She felt like a splash of milk on a slab of charcoal, an intruder in a world designed for iron and ink. Juncio waited for her at the base of the wide marble steps. He didn't offer his hand this time. He simply watched her with that same predator-like calm, his dark tattoo stark against the pale light of the late afternoon. "Enter," he said. Inside, the foyer was a cavern of polished black marble and floor-to-ceiling glass. There were no family photos, no soft edges, no warmth. Instead, there were monitors flickering in a side room and men with hard eyes positioned at every exit. The scale of it was suffocating. Trevor's betrayal had been loud and chaotic, a messy explosion of a weak man's fear. But this, Juncio's world, was quiet, disciplined, and infinitely more dangerous. Kioma stopped in the center of the hall, her reflection ghosting across the black floor. "Who are you, really?" she asked, her voice echoing off the glass. "Trevor was a coward, but I knew him. I don't know you. I don't know why you were in that church." Juncio turned slowly, his upright posture casting a long, sharp shadow across her white gown. "You knew a man who would leave you bleeding in front of 500 people to save his own skin," he said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "I am the man who takes what he wants and keeps what is his. You traded a man who feared the world for a man the world fears." He stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and cold air wrapping around her like a cage. "This is a fortress, Kioma. Inside these walls, you are untouchable. But do not mistake my protection for a lack of price. You are no longer an Ackhafer. You are mine." The realization hit her then, sharper than the sting of Trevor's ring being pulled away. She hadn't just been saved, she had been acquired. Trevor had been a mistake she could have walked away from, but Juncio was a destiny she would have to survive. The dining room was a hollow expanse of obsidian glass and sharp angles, lit by a chandelier that dripped like frozen rain from the ceiling. Kioma sat at one end of the long table, still draped in the ivory lace of her wedding gown, looking like a ghost haunting a modern mausoleum. Before her sat a meal of clinical perfection, untouched. At the head of the table, Juncio sat with his jacket removed, his black silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the full tail of the dragon tattoo coiling toward his ear. He didn't eat. He simply watched her, his glass of deep red wine catching the light. "You haven't asked why," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the estate's ventilation. Kioma looked up, her fingers twisting the platinum band on her finger, the one he had forced a coward to surrender. "I assumed it was for the scandal. A man like you. I'm sure there's a strategic advantage to owning a bride that the city's elite just discarded." Juncio set his glass down with a soft clink that felt as heavy as a gavel. Strategy is for those who are afraid of losing. I do not play games with public opinion. He leaned forward, his sharp jawline catching the amber light. I was in that church to observe Trevor Cole. He owed a debt to a subsidiary of mine, and I wanted to see if he was a man of his word. I wanted to see if he possessed the spine required to lead the life he was pretending to have. And, Kioma whispered, and I saw a boy who let his hands shake while he held the heart of a woman like you, Juncio said, his eyes narrowing with a predator's disdain. Trevor did not deserve you. It was a visual insult, a flaw in the order of things. In my world, we do not let something of high value be handled by a weakling. It is a waste of resources, an offense to the eyes. Kioma flinched at the clinical coldness of his words. So, I'm just a resource of high value. You married me to fix a visual error. I married you because I do not allow things that belong in a palace to be dragged through the mud of a public exit, Juncio replied, his voice dropping to a low, melodic vibration. I did not do it for love, Kioma. I do not believe in it. I did it to restore the hierarchy. You were a queen being humiliated by a peasant. I simply placed you back on a throne. He stood up, his tall, athletic frame casting a long shadow over the table. Eat. You will need your strength. Tomorrow, the world will come looking for a scandal. They will find only my wife, and they will find her untouchable. He turned to leave, his slow, deliberate stride echoing in the vast room, leaving Kioma alone with her untouched dinner and the terrifying realization that she had been rescued not by a savior, but by a restorer of lethal order. The heavy silence of the estate was broken the following afternoon by the frantic buzzing of a phone Kioma had forgotten she owned. It sat on a minimalist marble console, vibrating against the stone with a persistent, desperate energy. When she finally picked it up, her breath hitched. 64 missed calls, a dozen frantic texts, all from Trevor. Kioma, please, I made a mistake. I was panicked. That man, he's dangerous, Kioma. You don't know who he is. Let me explain. I'm outside the gate, please. A cold shiver raced down her spine, but it wasn't the fear Trevor intended. It was the pathetic nature of his arrival. He had shattered her in front of 500 people, and now he was groveling at the gates of a fortress he couldn't even enter. From the balcony, Kioma looked down toward the distant entrance of the estate. Trevor's silver sedan looked like a toy against the towering iron gates. He was standing outside the car, packing, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking small and boyish, the exact opposite of the monochrome power that now surrounded her. Suddenly, a fleet of 3 black SUVs appeared from the estate's secondary perimeter, moving with a tactical, synchronized grace. They didn't slow down as they approached the gate. They swarmed Trevor's car with the lethal precision of a predatory pack. 6 men in sharp black suits stepped out in unison. They didn't draw weapons, but their posture, upright, still, and radiating silent authority, was a weapon in itself. In the center of the driveway, Juncio appeared as if he had materialized from the shadows. He didn't rush. He walked with that same slow, deliberate stride Kioma had seen in the church. As he approached the gate, Trevor took a stumbling step back, his face going a sickly shade of white once more. Juncio signaled for the gate to open just a fraction. He didn't speak to Trevor, he spoke at him. The wind carried the low, melodic vibration of his voice up to the balcony. You fumbled the ring, Trevor. In my world, when you drop something of value, you lose the right to claim it. She's my fiancée. Trevor's voice was high and cracked with hysteria. You can't just take her. Juncio stepped into the small gap of the gate, his neck tattoo stark in the daylight. He leaned in, his eyes locking onto Trevor, with a predator-like calm. She is my wife, and if your shadow touches these gates again, I will ensure it is the last thing you ever cast. Juncio didn't wait for a reply. He turned his back, a final, insulting gesture of dominance, and the SUVs moved to block Trevor's view entirely. As the silver sedan screeched away in a cloud of dust and cowardice, Juncio looked up at the balcony. His eyes found Kioma. He didn't smile, but the message was clear. The shadow of her past had been erased with clinical finality. The grand ballroom of the Royal Metropole was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp diamonds. But to Kioma, it felt like a den of wolves. This was the Gala of Thorns, the annual gathering of the city's most powerful families, the very people who had watched her fiancé discard her like refuse only weeks ago. Now, they stood in small, whispering circles, their champagne flutes paused midair as she entered. Beside her, Han Junseo was a pillar of monochrome power. He didn't offer his arm in a soft, romantic gesture. He walked half a step ahead, his presence carving a path through the judgmental elite like a blade through water. His black tuxedo was of such high quality it seemed to swallow the ambient light, and the dragon ink on his neck was a silent, lethal warning to anyone thinking of whispering too loud. "Chin up, Kioma," Junseo said, his voice a low vibration meant only for her. "You are not here to be judged. You are here to be feared." They were immediately intercepted by the Vane family, old money with deep ties to Trevor's father. Mrs. Vane's eyes traveled over Kioma's deep emerald gown, a sharp contrast to her wedding white, with a thin, cold smile. "A surprising recovery, Kioma, to go from a jilted bride to this in such a short time. One wonders if the tragedy at the church wasn't just a staged opening for a new management." Kioma felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the emotional gravity that usually pulled her down. But before she could falter, she felt Junseo's hand settle firmly on the small of her back. The heat of his palm was a command to stand still. Junseo looked at Mrs. Vane, his eyes holding a predator-like calm that made the older woman's smile falter. "Management implies a business transaction, madam," he said, his tone melodic and jagged. "I prefer to think of it as a correction. Trevor Cole was a flaw in the landscape. My wife is the landscape." The insult was so precisely delivered that Mrs. Vane could only blink in stunned silence as they moved past. But the elite weren't the only ones watching. In the far corner of the ballroom, a group of men in gray suits, Junseo's rivals from the northern docks, watched with calculated intensity. They didn't see a bride. They saw a soft spot in the iron armor of the Han Syndicate. Kioma caught the eye of the lead rival, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckles. He raised his glass to her, a gesture that felt less like a greeting and more like a target being marked. For the first time, Kioma realized that being the boss's wife meant her life was no longer about escaping pity. It was about surviving the envy of men who played for blood. As the orchestra began a dark, rhythmic waltz, she realized the thorns in this room were much sharper than she had ever imagined. The gala had ended hours ago, but the adrenaline still pulsed beneath Kioma's skin. The silent threats from the men in gray suits remained etched in her mind, a stark reminder that she was now a permanent fixture in a war she didn't understand. She found Junseo in his private study, a room dominated by shadows and the scent of aged whiskey. He had discarded his dress shirt, sitting with his back to the floor-to-ceiling window. In the dim light, the monochrome power he usually projected was stripped away, replaced by something raw and haunting. For the first time, Kioma saw the full extent of the ink. The dragon didn't just crawl up his neck, its coils wrapped around his shoulder blades, its claws digging into a map of jagged, silvery scars that marred his athletic frame. Kioma gasped softly, her hand rising instinctively toward the largest mark, a deep indentation near his spine. Junseo didn't flinch, but the muscles in his back tightened, the dragon shifting as if it were breathing. "The world sees the suit and the name," Junseo said, his voice a low, jagged vibration. "They see the authority, they don't see the price of the ink." "Who did this to you?" Kioma whispered, her fingers ghosting just above his skin. "The men who thought they could own my father," he replied, turning slightly to look at her. His eyes held a predator-like calm, but behind it was a hollow, ancient grief. "When I was 12, they burned my home to teach him a lesson in loyalty. My father died trying to pull me from the light. This," he gestured to the ink covering the burn scars, "was how I reclaimed my skin. I became the monster that kept the others at bay. I took their syndicate, their streets, and their peace. I chose the dragon, so I would never have to be the victim again." The emotional gravity of his words pulled at Kioma. She had spent her life fearing the judgment of others, fearing the rejection of a man like Trevor. But Junseo had built a fortress out of his own wreckage. He hadn't just saved her at the altar to restore a visual hierarchy. He had done it because he recognized the look of a person whose world was being set on fire by cowards. "You're not a monster, Junseo," she said, finally letting her hand rest against the heat of his shoulder. He looked at her, his sharp jawline tight. "In this city, there is no difference between a monster and a king. One protects what is his with teeth, the other with a crown. I am both." In that quiet, dark room, the distance between them collapsed. Kioma realized that the dragon's ink wasn't just a sign of danger, it was a chronicle of survival. She had married the man the world feared, but for the first time, she felt she was seeing the man who feared nothing but losing the order he had bled to create. The evening air at the private charity auction was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, but the atmosphere felt brittle, like glass about to shatter. Kioma stood by a fluted champagne tower, her emerald gown catching the light, while Junseo stood a few paces away, engaged in a low-voiced conversation with a city councilman. Even in a room full of power, his monochrome power was the sun around which everyone else orbited. The shift was instantaneous. It began with a sharp, metallic clink from the balcony, a sound out of place in a room of soft music. Junseo's head snapped up, his predator-like calm sharpening into a terrifying focus. Before Kioma could even register the movement, he was moving. He didn't run, he lunged with a fluid, lethal grace that defied his broad frame. "Down," he barked, his voice a jagged command that cut through the chatter. A shatter of glass exploded inward. The men in gray suits from the docks had sent their answer. A high-caliber round whistled through the space where Kioma's head had been a second before, burying itself in a marble pillar with a dull thud. Screams erupted as the calculated chaos took hold, but Junseo was the eye of the storm. He tackled Kioma to the floor, shielding her body with his own. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the iron-hard muscles of his back pressed against her. As a second shooter emerged from the heavy velvet curtains, Junseo reached into the small of his back. He moved with a clinical, tactical precision that made time seem to slow down. He didn't hesitate. He didn't show fear. He rose just enough to level his weapon, his eyes cold and unblinking. 3 shots hissed from his suppressed handgun, phut, 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 and the thread in the curtains collapsed with a heavy silence. Junseo stood up fully then, stepping over a fallen chair to place himself between Kioma and the balcony. He looked like a god of war carved from obsidian. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse with the adrenaline of the kill. His men in black suits swarmed the room instantly, a synchronized wall of protection that moved with the same lethal order as their master. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that brooked no argument. Kioma looked at him from her place on the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had seen him as a savior and a restorer of order, but now she saw the monster he had described. He was terrifying, efficient, and absolute. As he scanned the room for more targets, his jaw set in a line of pure iron, Kioma realized that the man she had married wasn't just guarding her reputation. He was the line between her and the grave. The blood on the marble floor had been scrubbed away with clinical efficiency, but the copper tang of it still clung to the back of Kioma's throat. Back at the estate, the monochrome power of the fortress felt suffocating, a silent witness to the lethal display she had witnessed at the auction. She found Junseo in the center of the dark-paneled library, his black suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the heavy ink of the dragon. He was cleaning his weapon with the same slow, deliberate focus he applied to everything, a predator maintaining his claws. "Is this it then?" Kioma asked, her voice trembling but clear. "Is this the restoration of order, saving my life by taking another's?" Junseo didn't look up, the metallic click of the firearm echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "In my world, safety is not a right. It is a perimeter maintained by force. I told you I was a monster who kept the others at bay. Today, you simply saw the teeth." "I spent my life feeling small because Trevor was a coward," Kioma said, stepping into the light. "But here, I feel small because your shadow is so large. I went from a man who couldn't protect me to a man who protects me with a graveyard." Junseo paused, his hands going still. He finally looked at her, his sharp jawline set, his eyes unreadable yet intensely focused. He stood up, his tall, athletic frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over the black marble. He walked toward her, and for the first time he didn't stop until he was inches away, the scent of sandalwood and gunpowder wrapping around her. "I took that ring from a boy's shaking hand because I refused to see you broken," he said, his voice a low, jagged vibration. "But a queen should not be a captive. I gave you my name to save your dignity, but I will not use it to chain you." He reached into his pocket and placed a single, sealed envelope on the console between them. "Those are annulment papers, signed and ready. I have set up a trust in your name, enough to live anywhere in the world, far from Trevor and far from my wars. My men will escort you to the airport tonight if that is what you wish." Keoma stared at the envelope. It was the safe exit, the agency she had never possessed with Trevor, who had made his choice for her and left her with the ruins. Junseo was doing the opposite. He was handing her the match to burn the bridge he had built. "You are giving me a choice," she whispered. "I am giving you the only thing Trevor couldn't," Junseo replied, his predator-like calm softening into something raw. "A way to leave me without having to run." He turned away, giving her the room to decide. In the silence of the fortress, Keoma realized that while the dragon protected her with fire, the man was offering her the freedom to walk through the flames. The anniversary of the day the world shattered was not marked by a grand ballroom or the flash of paparazzi bulbs. Instead, the evening was draped in the monochrome power of a quiet terrace overlooking the city, the lights below twinkling like a carpet of fallen stars. A year had passed since Keoma had stood in the center of that library and looked at an annulment envelope, and tonight, the only paper in sight was the soft linen of a private dinner table set for two. Keoma leaned against the stone railing, her silk gown a deep, midnight blue that mirrored the sky. She no longer felt like a splash of milk in a world of charcoal. She moved with a physically grounded grace that matched the silent sentinels guarding the perimeter. She had stayed. She had walked through the fire of the Han Syndicate and found that while Junseo was a man the world feared, he was the only man who had ever truly seen her. The glass door slid open with a familiar, pressurized click. Han Junseo stepped onto the terrace, his upright, slow stride as commanding as ever. He had discarded his tie, his black shirt open at the neck to reveal the dragon tattoo that no longer signaled terror to her, but home. "The city is quiet tonight," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration as he came to stand behind her. He didn't hover. He provided a wall of silence that blocked out the rest of the world. "It's peaceful," Keoma whispered, turning to face him. Her eyes, once clouded by the emotional gravity of betrayal, were now clear and resolute. "A year ago, I thought my life ended in a church. I thought I was just a correction in your landscape." Junseo reached out, his warm, firm hand cupping her cheek. His predator-like calm had transformed into a concentrated, fierce devotion. "You were never a correction, Keoma. You were the only thing in that room that was real." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. When he opened it, the light from the moon caught a diamond of such exceptional clarity it seemed to glow from within. It was a crown of light held in a band of heavy, polished platinum. "I took the last ring from a coward's shaking hand to save your dignity," Junseo said, his voice dropping to a jagged, soulful rasp. "But I bought this one for my queen. I am not asking you to stay because of a vow made in a scandal, or a debt, or a fortress. I am asking you to stay because I am a man who is incomplete without his heart." He slid the ring onto her finger, replacing the ghost of the past with a weight that felt like a promise. Keoma looked at the ring, then up at the man who had reclaimed her from the mud. She didn't hesitate. She leaned into him, her hand resting against the dragon on his neck, choosing the monster who loved her over the world that didn't. In the silence of their private fortress, the real wedding finally began.